very warm welcome and good afternoon. My name's Nick Jones. I am the pet behaviourist with Petplan, and I'm here today on the Puppy Centre Facebook channel, coming to you live, answering your questions for all those naughty puppies out there. So I have my trusty helper Kim just in the background, and so Kim, fire away with your first question.
Okay. The first question, we've recently bought new sofas and now don't want our puppy jumping on them. Unfortunately, when he was younger, we didn't discourage him, so now he's used to jumping up onto our laps. How would you suggest we go about training him not to jump up, having let him do it for 5 months already?
Okay, so this is quite a common area actually, dogs gaining access to the sofas, and very often in my behaviour work I may come into a household and see a dog or find a dog that might be termed a little out of control, a dog that's helping itself to anything and everything. And whilst I'm not inherently against dogs being on the sofa, my little border terrier comes up on the sofa next to me quite frequently, but I'm more interested in the way that how it's done, because in theory I accept that you're saying you don't want it to continue any longer, and of course the dog ownership people have different views on their access to the sofa, the dog's access to the sofa. Some people will say they don't want their dog on the sofa at all. Some people will say, well, they would like it, but maybe for it to be on their terms. So the way it happens can vary quite a bit. As I just began to touch on, my personal philosophy on this is that your dog, if you chose to allow it so, can come on the sofa, but it should be with your say-so, upon your invitation. And equally, by the way, the dog should be getting off the sofa when you ask it to get off. And I simply use the command off, and I would point to the floor. But what you're presenting is not an unusual situation whereby at some point you think that's enough, you don't want the dog to come up. And the subject of new sofas, because they do get replaced from time to time, does come up. You need firstly to be able to provide your dog with a nice, soft, comfortable alternative on the floor. So the question for you is, well, if you're not giving your dog access to the sofa, which is fine, that's your prerogative, does the dog have a warm and comfortable option on the floor? So think about, in even one decent sized lounge, I might have at least one bed, but possibly two. If there are other dogs there, that might force that situation anyway, in the sense of more than one bed. And then let's imagine that you're sitting on the sofa. So here I am on my sofa, and the dog is, usually if you're keen, you can see your dog approaching the sofa. Now, it's always easier to prevent rather than to remove, although we'll talk about the removal as well. So if you see your dog looking to come up onto the sofa, it will probably glance and spy its spot or its location, or indeed you may know exactly where it likes to go. But if you see your dog approaching the sofa, then I would put up a flat hand, and I wouldn't overthink this, but I would say something along the lines of no, and then I would redirect the dog onto its own bed. All right? So preventing it in the first place is a great deal easier than the dog jumping up and then you having to remove it. So, but I am a realist, and I know that some dogs are very energetic. Some dogs can easily leap up onto the sofa despite you saying no. Doesn't, I realise, magically work, and that you may then need to react or to respond to the situation. So a little tip that could help you is that you keep a short lead on your dog, something about that long, and you could put that on a body harness or just around a traditional neck collar. Because when your dog does get up, that will allow you to use the lead. I won't stand up, but usually I would stand up, take the lead, and use the word off as you bring your dog off the sofa. No need to be heavy-handed with the dog, by the way. But you being clear with the dog can make a big difference, so that we are saying to the dog off, and then we're saying come on your bed, and you're using a more positive tone to bring the dog onto its own bed settle the dog there, then to leave it in the stay command, and then for you to come back to your sofa and to sit down. Now, if the dog does it again, you will simply need to be very consistent and persistent. Your dog is prepared to be persistent, potentially, in getting up into its favoured spot, but you need to be persistent as well. So once you have made a decision in your own home about on this subject about, well, the dog cannot get on the sofa any longer, you would need to be firm but fair, persistent, consistent, and the dog will get the message. There's another point that members of the family will need to be persistent and consistent as well. So if it's just a couple, you'll need to work together and to project exactly the same approach, or if there are other members of the family in the home as well, maybe children, or older people, that they will also need to help. Okay, so I think that is the key thing. Absolute consistency in the new rule. Provide the dog with a nice, soft, comfortable alternative, and also for you to be aware of the dog jumping up onto the sofa. Try to block it before it even happens, and that little lead on the dog can make a big difference as well. It gives you that additional control. I'm not a fan of taking dogs by collars and removing them, because then in some instances the dog will sort of bear into the sofa, become quite defensive potentially about you trying to take the dog by the collar, and that in some instances could lead to the dog being a little bit defensive and mildly aggressive, which we don't even want to go down that road. So that lead puts you in a very easy going position to control the dog. Okay, so thank you for that question. Incidentally, folks, if you can like and share the page and this post as it's streaming, that would help greatly. Thank you very much. So Kim, next question.
This is from Sharon Muir. My pup is still trying to bite every time we play. She's 6 months old. How can I stop this?
Okay, your puppy is 6 months old and still biting. Now, as a by the way, when a dog hits about 6 months, I begin to see it as a junior come adolescent dog. So you're beginning to move away from this concept of puppyhood. And indeed, the reason I mention this is that once you have that concept in your mind, then also it can allow you to think, well, actually I'm beginning not to deal with so much a baby here, but a dog which is capable of some more behaviours which are being thought through a little bit more, okay, and that you may here be looking at like a bit of a hangover from puppyhood. It's more of a bad habit, okay? But nonetheless, this always boils down to, well, that's all very interesting, but how do we stop this? And that's what we'll look at. So be cautious of a few things, or careful of a few things that you are being sure that you're not doing to actually exacerbate the behaviour or even to create it in the first place. There's a lot of advice given on how to stop biting and nipping, and to be honest with you, it really does depend on the severity, the dog's intent, because even a 6-month-old dog could be quite a handful and difficult to manage. And it's really a case of being sure that you're not overexciting the dog. Now, an excited dog has a ladder, let's say, of escalation, that particular behaviour. So here we have the behaviour at the very top, whereby you would deem it to be unacceptable and out of control. And this is where the nipping and biting is likely to occur. But so this is step 10. Coming back down, very simply, we have 7, 8, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And this at levels 1, 2 and 3 or thereabouts, we would have a dog which is gently playful in the home, and it is very unlikely that the dog would be biting and nipping at this level. So it's our duty, if that's the best word to use, to ensure that we don't overexcite the dog in the home. So in that respect, I often find that young dogs are not being exercised enough. This may or may not apply to you, and I'm sorry, I can only talk generally. But young dogs are not being exercised enough away from the home, not in the garden. The garden doesn't really constitute exercise, in my opinion, unless you have acres of land and 2 or 3 dogs and you're there involved, and where it would almost be a bit more of an exercise session. So the average garden, though, doesn't constitute exercise. So we need to be, and it again depends on how much exercise, depends on your breed, depends on the physicality of your dog. Some dogs are much more physical than others, so it really does vary a lot. So just ask yourself, is your dog being adequately exercised? This is something you could either discuss with me online or speak to your vet about it, or just speak to an experienced dog trainer that would have an insight on that. Because I see lots of dogs in homes which are behaving in this way, and one of the main 2 or 3 reasons that that's happening is because the dog is not being given every opportunity to exercise fully away from the home on a daily basis. So have a think about that. Is your dog being exercised adequately? And then combine that with being sure that you're not over exciting the dog in the home, and I think that can make a real big difference as well. As a golden rule, I do not allow, or certainly encourage, teeth on skin or clothing. This may sound a little bit overbearing, but actually if we start from the very beginning, imagine you have your young dog at 8 weeks, and so if we're looking from that 8, 10, 12 weeks onwards, if you start from the very beginning with some sort of interruption of the play, as soon as your dog is starting to bite or nip clothing or skin, then it can really set that rule in place from the very outset. I see lots of people, or I have seen people, actively allowing a dog to sort of maul on the hands, and because yes, the puppy loves it, and because they're very driven to explore the world and to clench their teeth as they go through their various phases of development on items, but that shouldn't be happening on clothing or skin. And if we can get that, because I realise there will be people listening and watching both during the broadcast today and indeed on replays later on, if you have you'll have puppies of all ages, and it's a really important thing to try your best to have this concept in your mind and then across the family that we are all not allowing the dog to nip us and to chew on us, our clothing and hands, okay? It's vitally important. I realise this question may come up again because things like toileting and nipping, maybe a couple of other areas, but these are very consistent questions, and that's absolutely fine. I love talking about puppy behaviour, but it's surprising, it can be surprising at how much distress and difficulty puppies can cause, because their behaviours are sometimes, a word that comes to mind is what I call unburstable. You know, that puppy is just unburstable. You can't seem to do anything to stop it from doing XYZ. So, but these behaviours actually, with a bit of thoughtful approach, are manageable. So the final point to leave you with is to provide your puppy with something that is appropriate to chew, because we have to appreciate that the dog developmentally wants to chew and on items, and it will have that desire. So what I tend to favour is a very simple approach, is something like a twisted rope toy with a knot on each end with all the little tassels, and you can get those all the way from tiny little things up to something quite substantial. And I would, if I was on the floor with the puppy and the puppy was on its back, the puppy would almost certainly be flashing its teeth. So I think, well, what do I put in that space? Well, I'll put in a rope toy. Okay, and the puppy can then chew on that. Puppies are intelligent enough to know that that isn't your clothing, or certainly they will come to realise that. So make sure you've got ample access when you are interacting with your puppy to appropriate alternative things for the dog to chew on. Okay, so great question, thank you very much, and I'm sure we'll probably come across similar versions of that again today, and that's fine if we do.
Here's another question. We are thinking about getting a puppy, but have young children aged 2 and 3. Should we consider getting a particular breed? We want to avoid anything that's overly aggressive or could scare them. Do you have any recommendations?
Okay, lovely. So picking a breed, this is not the easiest of situations for you because there's lots to consider in the sense of what breed is good for us. Now, we can't just loosely say, well, yes, this top 10 breeds are all going to be appropriate, because within those breeds you could theoretically have anything from giant dogs all the way down to a really quite pocket-sized little terrier, and in theory all of those, and in between, so big right down to small, and we could say, well, all of these breeds are theoretically appropriate for children, and none of them in particular are likely, although I realise I'm not really talking too much about breeds at the moment, but I'm just talking broadly. There's no reason why, if you choose a well-bred puppy and that you are satisfied that you the breeders are doing a good job, that the parents were well selected and had good temperament, so we should be looking for temperament unless you're getting into showing, but that's not what we're discussing here. So we're really looking for a dog which is bred for temperament, something that is actually quite calm and easygoing. As a quick aside, 70 to 80% of the dogs I see as adult dogs, average age of about 2, tend to be male. I have a male dog, he's 9 years old, he's gorgeous. Those of you that know Max, my wire-haired Vizsla. So there's not an ounce of harm in him at all. But male dogs tend to have more about them. They can be a bit more hormonally driven. Some of them can be a little bit more domineering and harder work potentially out of the home. So I don't think it's if it was 50-50, then well, it would be either or, wouldn't it? But to be in the realms of 70-80% of the dogs I see being male, I tend to encourage people to go towards the female of the breed, because I think they tend to be easier going. That is a broad generalisation, but I think it's no good me keeping this information to myself. I'm here to help you make a good decision. There is no particular reason, referring to something you said in your question, why any dog you choose is going to be aggressive. That tends to be a result of a few things, such as, in no particular order, being poorly bred in the first place. So what were the parents like of that puppy? Were one of them particularly aggressive? Did one of the parents show quite a bit of aggressive behaviour towards the puppies? Whilst we're on the subject of the breeding, you know, was the puppy reared in the home, exposed to family life, or was it reared in a kennel at the bottom of the garden with very little interaction? That can make a profound difference on the temperament of a puppy. What is the puppy, once you acquire the puppy, being trained and socialised adequately? Those are big subjects that are too long for me to go into detail here, but the subjects of good old-fashioned obedience training, the sit, the down, the stay, the walking to heel, the coming back when you call, but those 5 or 6 are really important. Getting them to a nice pet standard, which is pretty straightforward, is really important. And then the big subject of socialisation. You have a particular window for socialising a puppy from 8 to 16 weeks, okay? And it continues after that, but that is where you would look to think about your lifestyle and the environment that you live in, and to think of all the different things that you know your dog will need to cope with. So it might sound like I'm sort of forgetting the question. I'm not. It's just that the question is such a big one and there's so many things to consider. One thing I do encourage people to do when they're at this sort of loose a situation in terms of what breeds, go online and Google for things like dog breed selection quiz or dog breed or puppy selection questionnaire. There are a few that will come up, and I've been myself in previous years through those things, and it's been interesting to see what comes up, because I knew at the back of my mind what I might like, but these questionnaires can throw up some different options because they take into account things like whether the dog sheds or not, or how much exercise the dog needs, whether I want to go jogging with the dog, or whether I want it to follow me alongside as I go cycling. So you can do some of those things easily with some breeds, so it's just a case of thinking about what maybe the parents want to do with the dogs as well as the children. So I think in theory you could have, some people might disagree, but I think in theory you could have virtually any breed with children, provided you do all of the aforementioned things: the socialisation, the training, the due diligence when selecting a puppy, and the way that that puppy was reared. Because when you inherit a puppy at 8 weeks, that's immense, the amount of input that that puppy may or may not have had, okay? So I am going to resist the temptation to get into specific breeds. I coincidentally just last week posted a blog post though on this very subject. If you have a little look on alphadogbehaviour.co.uk and then go to the blog, there is a blog there that sets out what I thought were the top 10 breeds that you might like to consider for children. So have a look, see what you think, and I hope that helps, because that will take you alone 30 minutes to read it. So good luck, and thank you again for the question.
Okay, our puppy has started digging up our garden. He's a Collie Cavalier cross. Any ideas how to stop this? We only have to turn our backs for a minute and another hole appears. Right,
dogs digging in the garden. So there's always a difference between theory and practice, but I do sort of hear myself start off these sentences saying, well, in theory, this is quite easy to address. But in theory, it is, because what some new puppy owners do as a mistake that can be easily made is that they leave the dogs to their own devices in the garden. We've actually had a quite a good spate of weather recently. So even now it's relatively mild as we're here in the autumn. And this can mean that doors are left open, young dogs are given access into the garden, which is fine. But the problem is that the owners then think, well, the door's open, I know that he will generally toilet in the back garden of his own accord, I will go and do something else. But the problem with that then is that the young dog is being given access to an area that we haven't really trained it in yet, and we haven't satisfied ourselves that the dog is old enough and trustworthy enough to be left in that space without damaging it, basically. So that's my thinking. It's really one of supervision. If your dog is in the garden and you're not there to supervise, your dog is not to know any better. Dogs will do doggy things, and digging and barking and chasing things is all come under that sort of doggy things behaviour heading. So you need, especially in the first year of any young dog, you need to supervise, and then supervise. Because as soon as your dog starts to dig, you need to be in a position where you can interrupt that behaviour and then to redirect that behaviour. So let me explain a little more on those two words. Interruption, how well, it depends on the size of your garden, but let's say your dog was in a corner on some of the earth on the edges. I would use something like a 15-foot training line, just clip it on the dog's lead or onto a harness, and as soon as it steps onto the borders, so I'm imagining here a relatively normal sized garden with a grassy patch in the middle and borders around the edges. This is, I go to people's homes on a virtually daily basis, and that as an image is pretty accurate. And common. So as soon as the dog is stepping onto the borders, off the grass onto the earth, I would stop the dog physically using the line, and I would bring the dog off using the line as well. But as soon as it steps on, I would use the command off Now the dog doesn't particularly know what off means, but with your repetition via the supervision, you will be able to install that quite easily. So you could be holding the line, especially if you know your dog predictably goes onto the borders. As soon as it does so, just stop it with the lead, give it a gentle tug, bring the dog off the earth as you combine it with the command off. Very, very simple. Keeping it simple is important. Once the dog is on the grass, you can then change into, oh, good boy, he's a clever boy. And you can have some interaction with the dog because you're there and present to supervise. So keeping the dog off the borders is really important. I realise you don't define it as such, but the dog could be digging in the grass or the borders or anywhere. But regardless, I do go to homes with young dogs, and I've seen that the borders especially have been weeded in not quite the way the owner hoped for. So that's something that we need to manage. And also make sure that the dog is getting adequate exercise. Again, I touched on this earlier, but is the dog letting out lots of its energy in the garden via digging, when really it should be getting that additional exercise away from the home? Because what I would hope for you is that when the dog is in the garden, it's just basically crashed out and relaxing and enjoying itself in that environment. Okay, so to recap, supervision, absolutely key. I would go so far as to say not to let your dog in the garden unless you're there with it. It's exactly what I do. So please don't think I have one way and I give people different advice. That's what I do, and would do that within the first year. Have a line on your dog so you can manage it easily. Supervision, and make sure the dog's getting adequate exercise. Okay, so I hope that helps. Good luck though. Thank you.
Our next question. Our puppy is 12 weeks and has just had his second injections, but we have to wait another week before walking. He will not go to the toilet outside in the garden. He goes outside quite happily. I thought this followed on well from the last garden question. He goes out quite happily, but always comes back to do whatever he needs to do inside. Any tips to help with this? Okay,
so developing a toilet training habit in your young dog so that it's effectively going out of the home on a reliable basis does require on your part a fair bit of systematic thinking and working with the dog so you set up a habit. Habits are only created in dogs through two words I've used already today, but persistence and consistency. And that is an approach that will train the dog effectively to understand where and when you want it to relieve itself. So, and also it comes back to the subject or the element of supervision. Are you supervising your dog closely enough? I would, because a 12-week-old dog is still very, very young, I would come back on yourself a little and think, I'm going to give this dog an hourly break. I can't really go into where you are and how often with your dog, but I will assume that you are with the dog at least to set that sort of habit up. So an hourly visit into the garden, whereby in between I would keep the door closed because I want you to manage the dog's opportunities to go outside. I can see the logic. I was just touching on this earlier about access into the garden and digging up the garden. So leaving a door open seems like a very logical thing to do, but it can actually work against you, I find. So if you shut the door, that then, however, does put a big onus on you to make sure you're taking the dog out on an hourly basis. Now, an hourly visit to the garden may be too often, or it may not be often enough, so you will need to filter that advice of every hour through the reality of what you know your dog needs. But we'll stick with the hour for now. Every hour you take your dog out to the garden. I would personally be putting the dog on a lead, and then you can allow the dog to go in a set location, which is the biggest advantage of going out on the lead. That can in some cases work against you, so go with it, see what works best for you. You're welcome to give me feedback in the questions and answers later on, and I will look at those. But having a lead into the garden, when the dog does do its business, because this is the idea, you're managing the dog so closely that in a way you're funneling its behaviour to in such a way that you're giving it no choice but to go in the garden in that located area, because physically he will have to relieve himself at some point. When he does go, you can then be there because you have the lead and you're supervising. You can reward what you do want. So in a way, we're really placing a much greater emphasis on rewarding the behaviour we do want, rather than to stress about what the dog is doing, which is the area of what you would call, well, I don't want him to do this, which is toileting in the home. And to stop that, you will need to really watch him like a hawk. It might be 5 days where you are obsessively watching him, so that you're looking out, because there are precursors to a dog peeing in the home. There will be some sniffing, there will be some standing still, looking a bit thoughtful. It will be circling, it will be going to the area where he's maybe used a couple of other times and the residual scent is still there. So if you are there to supervise and to manage really carefully, you can stop what's happening in the home, which is essential as well, and then you can, with this nice consistent pattern, really place an emphasis on what you do want, which is going out into the garden with you every hour, with you there to supervise and to reward the behaviour you do want. Just a quick word about puppy training pads. I can see that in some instances they help, but personally I don't use them. I think that they can set up it can give the dog permission in a part of its head that it's okay to pee in the home, and that you will eventually at some point think, well, I now need to remove the pads, and there will in essence be a behaviour or a habit that you then want to stop, which actually you encouraged in the first place. So as I say, I can see the logic in pads in some circumstances, but effectively try not to use them is my best advice, and place an emphasis on showing the dog what it is that you do want. Okay, good luck. Thank you for that question. What else do we have, Kim?
Okay, this is a timely one. We have Halloween and bonfire night coming up. How can I ensure that my new puppy isn't scared by some of the loud noises and fireworks, etc.? Okay,
lovely question. Very pertinent to this time of year. Just to recap, the question was how can we help safeguard a puppy being frightened of fireworks and those associated noises. So the reason I particularly like this question is that it's a question that is looking ahead as a preventative measure. What you're not saying here, and it could be the case, and if it were, in fact, my answer would be the same. But we are looking on a preventative level of how we can arm, or to sort of equip is a better word, our puppy with skills to cope when unexpected fireworks go off. The simple answer to this is to get yourself a sounds CD. It is a CD that you play to desensitize your dog to the high quality recordings of firework displays. That's the short way of putting it. What we would usually do here is to play the CD at very low level whilst distracting the dog, such as having a little play with the dog in the room, or maybe you could use it throughout its meal times, or you could give it a device filled with soft or food or bits of kibble that release slowly. But we really do it in a very subtle way, starting at low volumes, and then as you can see that the puppy is coping with the sounds playing at the very low volumes, that progressively every few days you can turn it up a little. Okay, make sure you're playing the CD on a good quality system so it sounds fairly realistic. Any of these little Bluetooth speakers tend not to be good enough in my experience. And that's the short answer. Desensitize it ahead of time with that CD, and that is exactly what I will be doing myself in February next year maybe, when we are hoping to get a puppy ourselves. So it's thinking about prevention rather than cure, and that and this subject is a excellent example of how we can expose our dog in a controlled way when the dog is really a lot more receptive to these sounds at a young age, rather than coming to the point later on and realizing that the dog, maybe when it's sort of 9-12 months, is really not happy with fireworks, and then having to really take a longer process to get to the same point of as an outcome. But thank you for that question. I do encourage you all to think about things that you can do to proactively expose your dog, especially when they're young. This sorry for being repetitious, but that 8 to 16 weeks is a key time for you to safely and carefully expose your dog to things that you know that it's likely to experience as an adult. If you, because they don't really question it, they're much more sponge-like, they're much less fearful in that special space. That is why between 8 and 16 weeks, give or take, it is called the socialization period. So the more you can do in that period, the better. Do your research on the socialization period, and it will save you quite potentially a lot of stress further down the line. But thank you.
Okay. Rodney is extremely sociable,
Rodney.
which we love about him and do not want to change that. However, how can we stop him from running towards strangers when walking off the lead and pulling towards them when on the lead? He just wants to say hello, but not all people appreciate him lunging towards them with such enthusiasm. I hope you can help. Thank you.
So Rodney's the name of the dog. That's
Yes.
a great name. So the question for you is, which is what you've asked me, is how do you stop your dog running up to other people in public? Now, it's good that your dog is mixing with people, but you should be able to say, Rodney, stop, come here at any point, okay? But I'm imagining you don't have that. In essence, that is the beginning of a recall. The mistake some people can make is they think, right, my dog is now fully vaccinated, I've got the green light from the vet, I can take him to the local park. So they go into the local park and they think, well, isn't this marvellous? And they say, okay, unclip the dog, and off the dog goes. It's running around, having a whale of a time, mixing with dogs and people, and life is good. And I love it. That sounds really appealing. However, here's the problem. How are you going to get your dog back when you really need to? If you're lucky, your dog will be super compliant out of the box, as it were, and the recall just sort of works and that we don't have any issues. But with our young dogs, I don't want you to assume that that will happen. I want you to take a more progressive approach. So in essence, I would revert to the use of a long training line. I use this in lots of adult dogs that have got to their adulthood and they maybe didn't do what I'm advising you to do here. But all of those recall problems in adult dogs can be addressed when we have a young dog. So what young dogs can learn is that ignoring you is beneficial. You call the dog, it hears you, but it makes a decision that actually playing with other dogs is more fun, and that potentially when it comes back to you, it's the end of the walk and what have you, which isn't quite so much fun. So come back on yourself. Put a 30 or 50 foot training line on your dog. Use lots and lots of recalls throughout each walk. Use high value food, some little bits of chicken or bits of liver, something of that nature that you know your dog is really keen on, so that you can reward its efforts when it comes back to you. But the long line will put you in a much, much better position, because the dog cannot learn to ignore you. If you call the dog and he does ignore you, well then you can just wind the dog into you gently, and that in essence 100% of your recalls will succeed quite promptly as well, because you're there in a good position to enforce the recall. And then as you feel more confident in your dog, you can let go of the line and let your dog run around again, and to continue to issue lots of recalls. But if he does ignore you or he has a forgetful moment, you can jump on the line, pick it up, bring him in closely to you, have a fuss, give him some food, and then let him go again. This is not incidentally about not having the recalls, not having the interactions with people. We want that, of course we do, but you should, if I may say, be in a position where you can make a decision about another dog and a person, and as to whether you want your dog to have that opportunity to say hello or not. Because I think it's quite acceptable for you as the owner to say, well, you wouldn't be actually saying this, but for you to think that, well, no, I don't want him to go over there. That might be because there could be a road between you. If you're on a common, there might be a road cutting through, and your puppy could blindly run across that road. So go and say hello to the dog. So you should be able to stop your dog and to recall him or her. You may simply not like the look of the other dog. You might know that other dog isn't very tolerant with puppies. And so all of these elements of decisions that we make, that our puppies don't really have the ability to think ahead in that way. An older, more senior dog could do that, potentially, but young dogs, they're just a bit crazy, and it's our job to manage them. And if the dog is not coming back when you call it, then how do we do it? Well, we revert to the recall training program, which is the long line. There are other approaches, but the long line is just so straightforward. It costs virtually nothing to implement, and it's just about practice and repetition. So hope that helps. Good luck, lots of time and effort. Be consistent with your dog and it will come together. When you do make approaches towards other dogs and people, I like and encourage the owner to be present. So I call it a controlled walk up. We might have the dog alongside us, still with the long line on, but then we can feed the line in gently and then let the dog have a greeting with the other dog. I'd much prefer that than, say, your puppy charging in at 100 miles an hour and quite possibly getting itself into trouble, quite possibly being told off by the other dog if it doesn't like that. Lots of dogs won't like it. So you're giving your young dog guidance and direction, which is absolutely our role. You know, we all have that role as dog owners. So thank you for that.
Okay.
Kim, what do you have next?
I have 2 puppies and one keeps eating the other's food. How can we stop this happening and make sure that they get the correct amount of food each?
Okay, 2 dogs eating each other's food. This, the simple way to address this is through means of management. Now, you could eat, I don't encourage you to feed them right next to each other like this. I do see people occasionally think, I've got 2 dogs, 2 food bowls, and I expect them to eat within inches of each other without any problem. If you're doing that, I think that's a little unrealistic and I don't recommend it. The simple way that you could address this, does she say how old they are, Kim? Don't think they were, no. But I think the simple way, there are various ways you can do this. If you have crates for them each, you could feed them in their individual and respective crates. Shut the doors, and then you can give them a good 10-15 minutes to eat and just settle a little afterwards. So I would be inclined to do that if you have 2 crates. Alternatively, you could put them in separate rooms. So one could be in the utility room and the other could be in the hallway or in the kitchen, whatever works for you, given your home layout. Or another approach is that if you wanted to feed them both in the same room, is that you remained present to supervise the behaviour. So you've got really one in this corner and one over in that corner, and I would, off the top of my head, suggest that you have them at least a good 10 feet apart. I don't see any reason to have them any closer, and that you are there. And if you've got one over here and one over there, I would be watching them, and if one starts coming over to eat the other's food, because some dogs do eat out of 2, one dog could eat a lot faster, that's not unusual, and one may have less to eat depending on the size of the dog and the breed, sort of thing. So but if you see this dog coming over to eat this dog's food, then I would intercede by walking in and going, up, no, over there, or maybe then putting it out into the garden, something of that nature. So you'll need to be realistic. Please don't feed your dogs next to each other and expect them just to eat only their bowls. It's unrealistic. But great question, and something that I have looked at before, so very good, thank you.
Okay, next one. My small dachshund is normally very calm when left on his lead, and he seems to like to play with smaller dogs of his size. When he comes across a bigger dog though, he tends to bark at them and be more aggressive. How can I teach him not to react like that to bigger dogs?
Okay, so you've got to love a dachshund. Everybody loves dachshunds in my experience. Now, with a small dog behaving in this way, I would, yet again, put a line on the dog when you're out in public, because although we can accept that your little dog may find those bigger dogs a bit intimidating, the question for us as owners is, well, can I stop my dog running over there and indulging and even practicing that unwanted behaviour? If the answer is no, and of course if it's off the lead that's likely to be your answer, then putting a 15-20 foot line, maybe longer, it depends on how active your dachshund is, could be enough for you to either hold the line or to step on it and to stop your dog from going over there and engaging in that behaviour, because that is your absolute first step. Do I have control? Am I able to stop my dog going into that situation and getting itself into more trouble? So that's where the long line can be really useful. Now, I'm not in any way avoiding this question, but you may actually find that that is a situation that becomes better through the fact that you're increasing your control, which you're assisting your dog by doing that, and as your dog actually matures and becomes more settled in himself, and that you are not letting the dog, because you've got the line on the dog, you're not letting him become that het up, because if your dog is out of beyond your physical control, he is able to take that behaviour into a level which is not good for the dog. So I hope that makes sense, because by regaining control of the physical body of your dog, we can actually stop its mental state from, well, actually probably to sort of do it this way, from deteriorating too much, and that we can stabilise the dog more because we are there and able and present to deal with your dog's behaviour. So it might sound a bit thin as an answer, but actually by having that physical control, that makes the world of difference. Then you can help your dog decide on where to go next. So the questions then for you might be, do we approach this dog? Do I, as the owner, like the look of this dog? Do I think it would be suitable to take my little Daxie over there and to have an introduction? If the answer to that is yes, then, well, you're on to a positive route, because you have the dog on the line. You could slowly go over and to have a little introduction. There's no real reason why a little dog cannot interact with a much bigger dog. Okay, it does of course depend, it's a two-way thing, it depends on the behaviour of the bigger dog. You could set up some meetings with some bigger dogs that you know might generally press the buttons on your smaller dog, but if you know that that dog is calm and safe and good around all dogs, that might be something for you to look into, because naturally we don't want the behaviour of your small dog actually triggering something in another dog that does cause it to be aggressive to your noisy dachshund. So I think you'll just have to sort of use a bit of common sense. Bear in mind that your dog is young. Address the level of control, because your dog should not, in the nicest way, but your dog should not be running into these situations without your ability to stop him. Okay, that's why you'll often hear me talking about, especially behaviours in public, is do you physically have control of your dog? Incidentally, with the introduction of long lines, if we do start using them, we hope to go through a process where actually we can trust the dog enough to remove that line eventually. So good luck. Just take your time with it, and if I can be of any further help on that, just give me a shout on the answer section on this feed, and I'll happily answer that for you later on. Thank you.
Okay, next question.
Yeah.
My Labrador puppy is 9 months old and keeps jumping on top of me, humping, mouthing and biting my clothes. What can I do? I've tried saying no and getting up and walking off, not sitting near him and giving him distractions like toys, etc. I'm at the end of my tether.
Oh dear.
Please help.
It doesn't say whether it's a boy or...
No.
I'm going to make an assumption that with the humping and the excessive behaviour, it's probably a young male, and it's very difficult because depending on how depending on your style of interacting with the dog, if the dog knows that you are quite easy and more of a pushover, and that it can manage you more than you're managing it, then it can be a bit of a slippery slope. I actually think that because once we get into the realm of 9 months, as I was suggesting earlier, that we're really beginning to approach an adult dog, and that some of that behaviour, unless you safely and carefully address that behaviour now, it could deteriorate. Okay, I don't mean to be melodramatic, but in fact it could. It's not going to, because lots of people hope that their puppies will just grow out of these behaviours, but what you're explaining there, I can sort of see it in my mind's eye, and that is a difficult situation for you to be in. So I'm going to, at the beginning, suggest that you seek some professional help. You can by all means write in the comments below, and I can point you in the direction of a practitioner in your area, or I would be happy to help you myself if you're in my area. Going on from that, I think I'll give you a couple of little tools that could help you. Keep a lead on your dog when you're home. You only leave the lead on the dog when you're there to supervise, because we would not leave a lead on the dog at night, for example, or leave a lead on the dog when you went out in the day. Because when you're home and present, I can sort of see you with that sort of breed struggling physically to get control. That you could be trying, the only option you'll have is by grabbing its collar, which is not conducive to a speedy intervention, and one that is also calm. We don't want the dog feeling that you're being sort of aggressive towards it, because that could add even more flames to the fire. So having a lead on the dog gives you a much bigger opportunity to take the lead of the dog, and then to stand up. You must stand up. Don't try to think that you can manage a dog sitting down. Once you're stood up, you will be over the dog by 2+ times its own height, so that will be a big advantage for you. If I were with you, I might give you different techniques, but in the absence of giving, in this situation, just trying to give you advice over this Facebook live session, I would say then, as soon as your dog is doing something which is unacceptable, I would implement a little timeout. How do we do timeouts, and what is it? Well, a timeout is you removing the dog from that situation for a short period of time so it can settle down. Okay, now we tend to think with puppies it's all toilet training and you know, nipping problems, but actually you're in the realms now of an older puppy where some of these problems can become quite serious if not addressed in due course. So the timeout is something I would do for 1 minute. You would leave the dog in a secure and safe room, something like a utility room can work well, something like a kitchen where the dog can't get up to too much mischief once in there. And the timeout then would allow you to shut the door, to look at your watch and to think, right, 1 minute, I'm going to wait. If there's any barking or scratching or whining, I would ignore it, okay? At the end of that minute, the chances are your dog will be calm and quiet. You can then go into the dog quietly, calmly, lift the lead, and then take the dog back into the room you were in before you gave the time out. Let's say that would be your lounge. And so you could then put the dog back into its bed and to observe his behaviour. If he starts jumping all over you again, or anything, as soon as that happens, do be sure that your timing is good. Don't allow it to escalate and then lose your patience at step 10. If you know that some of this behaviour is starting at levels 2 and 3, stop it there. If your dog isn't listening to you and you feel that that behaviour is deteriorating more, lift the dog's lead and implement another timeout. Sometimes the timeout might need to be repeated 2, 3, 4 times before the dog actually gets the idea, and then can be calm in that environment with you. Because what you're trying to say to the dog is, if you're calm and pleasant and well behaved, you can stay with me or us. If you do that untoward behaviour, I will, without saying anything, so you don't need to shout, you don't need to be rough, but be quick and assertive. Don't be frightened to be firm, and to lead the dog out of the room, but be consistent with it. I am a realist. I do know that that may not necessarily solve it. I'm not saying that do that and it will solve it, but that's a good starting point and could give you a good little secret weapon to scrub off some of this silly behaviour. Because if it's silly behaviour, it should be quite easy, he says, to address it. But as it gets a bit more sinister and more annoying and more difficult, then you may need professional help. So I think you will inherently know what level you're at, and then to act accordingly. If I was looking at that sort of behaviour on a behaviour visit, I would, for the record, be spending lots of time looking at all the other dogs' behaviours in the home, right from waking up to going to bed. So looking at all the different elements, because it does pay to stop and gather all of that in, because everything affects everything else, doesn't it? Everything has a knock-on effect, and it can be random, it can be mishmash, you know, but that's why it pays greatly to stop and to have a good assessment and a good overview on where you are with your dog and what it's doing that could be leading your dog to do these behaviours that you're asking me about today. So I hope it's not easy, your situation, and answering it isn't easy, but have a think on the things I've said. Feel free to contact in the comments, and if I can be of any further help, I'll be glad to do so. But good luck.
I think we've got time for one more.
Oh, yes.
My 5-month-old puppy has regressed on toilet training, weeing and pooing in the house, also nipping and biting. Awful behaviour. I'm at my wit's end. I need some advice, please.
Okay, so being at your wit's end with a puppy, the last person was at their wit's end as well, and it is this element of how it's surprising how much distress puppies can cause. You've actually got there a situation that again sounds like you could benefit from having somebody spend some time with you to pick through these areas and to bring them apart, to address them in their individual ways, but remembering that they're all connected. So whilst you might sort of see individual strands with these problems, actually they're all connected ultimately back to the same source. So toilet training we've touched on a bit today. It's really about consistency. Focus on what you do want. Take your dog out into the garden on a lead hourly. It's a good, I usually advise hourly, but you may in practice find that you could do it, you might need to do it every 40 minutes or maybe every 90 minutes. So it depends on your dog, but hourly is a good starting point. Focus on what you do want, which is your dog relieving himself in the garden every hour. Most puppies will be able to do something on most of those visits. Then when you're in the home, you obsessively observe the dog. If this is easier said than done, I realise, but if you can't observe the dog directly, this is why I do favour crates, because if a dog is introduced to a crate from the beginning, which I do recommend, then we have a place where we can, well, the crate manages the dog for us to a degree. We need to use the crate sensibly and not to overuse it or abuse it in that way, but with sensible use of the crate, you can put the dog in the crate and think, well, it's highly unlikely that he will pee in that crate, so that would allow you to go up and have your for example, your morning getting ready routine without having any accidents in the interim. So that's my basic advice for toileting. Focus on what you do want, manage the dog very, very carefully, and supervise the dog very carefully when he's in the home. It's absolutely typical that as soon as you turn your back on a puppy, it's happened to me on puppy visits even, as soon as we turn our back, we turn around and oh, he's had a pee. And it can happen just like that. Okay, but that is something, it won't last forever. You will be able to get on top of it, but you must be persistent. Untoward behaviour in a puppy, a big broad subject because you're not terribly definitive on what exactly is going on, but watch out that the dog is not being overexcited in the home. Ensure that the dog's getting adequate exercise away from the home, okay? And also think about things like nutrition and diet. Is your dog being fed any additives or preservatives, colourings that may be encouraging some of these more wild behaviours? I think anybody that would say to me they're at their wit's end, and that's fine, I work with many people that have been at their wit's end and I sympathise, I really do, but seek some professional help, okay? Because I think that would give you a more realistic chance of making a best shot of this. Feel free to put comments below and I will do my best to go into that in more detail with you, or if I can't help, I would try to get you a contact that you can speak to locally. So folks, the hour has come to an end. Time seems to speed up actually when I do these questions and answers, but thank you all very much indeed for your questions. It's a pleasure as always to answer them. I look forward to speaking to you all again in the very near future. So have a lovely Sunday evening and bye bye for now.